Hello, I'm Doug, and welcome to the Krewe of Japan podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture.
This time on Krewe of Japan podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. Back to business after a hurricane-related weather event delayed this episode's release last week. But having to release this week maybe was a blessing in disguise, because now we can mention how Shogun absolutely slayed at the Emmys, adding 18 awards to the show's first season's list of accolades. So like any other good content creator would do, we are going to capitalize on riding that Shogun wave with this episode, where we sit back down to discuss William Adams, the real-world inspiration for Shogun's John Blackthorne, with guest host Dr. Samantha Perez and PhD candidate of East Asian Studies at Princeton, Nathan Ledbetter. In our previous episode, we focused on the life of the African samurai Yasuke and other events setting the stage for the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate. In today's episode, we fast forward about 20 years, a time where Japan finds itself in a state of flux after the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. During this time, a Dutch ship named the Liefde unexpectedly arrived on the shores of Kyushu with a passenger aboard named William Adams. With our two brilliant historians, the crew pieces together this man's extraordinary life, unpacking how an English navigator far from home managed to not only survive, but thrive in Japan, rising to the rank of Hatamoto, a direct retainer for the powerful Tokugawa Ieyasu. We explore a wide variety of topics pertaining to Adams, including how he came to Tokugawa's service.
Initially, he was given a reward in gold, but was not allowed to leave. Ieyasu wanted to keep him there, kind of keep learning from him.
Which accounts of Adams' life is the most reliable?
Congratulations, you have these sources from William Adams, and then you have the historical problem of trying to see how much is accurate and how much is William Adams just being very proud.
That's the interesting thing when you're able to layer it with letters from Richard Cox, who was the main English merchant, and John Serres, both of whom at various times had very high-profile arguments and feuds with William Adams.
The historical accuracy of the original and more recently released modern adaptation of Clavell's Shogun.
It's this fictional character that's drawing inspiration from William Adams, but he's not William Adams. And I feel like that gives license to do things which I deeply enjoyed from the latest version.
And much more. Now we've set the course, and it's time to hoist our sails and navigate through the life of one of history's most unlikely samurai. So sit back, relax, and prepare to embark on a journey across oceans and cultures that will drop us off in the 1600s in Japan as we bring you the fascinating story of William Adams. Let's go. Football is back, y'all. Yeah, I know this is a Japan-themed podcast, but the NFL is pretty big here in New Orleans, whether the team is good or bad. But with the start of the season upon us, support your favorite team and the podcast and Japan Society New Orleans all at the same time when you shop with NFLshop.com. Using our link, we'll just take you to the NFL Shop landing page and then carry on with buying all that swag. That's all you gotta do. And as always, we appreciate any and all support. Who dat? Here's what's going on with Japan Society New Orleans. Be sure to check the show notes for links and more information. Here we go. On Monday, September 23rd at 6 p.m. at Jefferson Parish Public Library, Old Metairie Branch, Japan Society's Japanese Culture Series kicks back off with a presentation on Lafcadio Hearn and his importance to Japanese folklore and the New Orleans Matsue Sister City connection. On October 2nd at 6:30 p.m., come on out to NOLA Brewing and Pizza Company to meet our Matsue Sister City exchange delegation just before they depart for Matsue and learn a little bit more about the city as a whole. And as always, there's our monthly happy hour at NOLA Brewing and Pizza Company every third Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. For more information and details about these events and future events, follow us on the website and social media. Everything will be linked out in the show notes. Hope to see you there. Hey, are you new to the crew? Yokoso. We hope you enjoy this episode. If you like what you hear today, then you'll really love our back catalog of episodes from earlier this season and previous seasons. We've had some incredible guests, like YouTuber Shinichi Mine of Tabi Eats, revealing Japan's best ramen. Founder of Ikigai Connections, Kasha Lynch, helping start your Japan-related career today. Author of the Remembering the Kanji book series, Dr. Jim Heisig, discussing Japanese language study, and so much more. After you finish up this episode, hit that subscribe button or follow or whatever it is, and get notified when new episodes come out. Then while you wait for the new episode to drop, play catch up with the crew. But before you do any of that, let's dive into today's episode. We mentioned William Adams a few times already. Just recently, Samantha did.
I do what I can, Doug.
So let's talk about William Adams. I feel like it's a good transition from Yasuke, whose story, literally, I think it was maybe, 10 years before William Adams landed on Kyushu, right?
20.
Was it 20?
-ish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some time passed. We've had a couple unifiers that come through, roll up. Toyotomi, Ieyasu, make their presence known. But then we have William Adams that pulls up on shore with the Dutch crew. Could you give us a little bit more backstory on William Adams and what brought him to Japan?
And such an interesting counterpoint to what we just saw with the Jesuit perspective.
Yes, absolutely. As I'm sure we will dive into. So rather than me summarize it, I'm going to let William Adams himself do so.
Okay.
I'm going to read from a letter that he wrote in 1611 to his unknown friends and countrymen. He sent this letter with another Englishman who had arrived on a Dutch ship after he had, trying to let them know that he was alive. I'll skip the initial pleasantries, but he says, "I would like whoever receives this letter to know that I am a man from Kent, who was born in the town of Gillingham, which is 2 English miles from Rochester and 1 mile from Chatham, where the ships of the King's naval fleet are docked. From the age of 12, I lived at Limehouse, near London, where I apprenticed under ship carpenter Mr. Nicholas Diggins for 12 years. After that, I served as both a captain and a pilot on Her Majesty's ships. Then I spent the next 11 or 12 years working for the Company of Barbary Merchants, staying with them right up until the opening of the trade route between Holland and India. From that point on, I desired to work on this route to India using the little knowledge I have been given by God. In the year of our Lord 1598, I was hired to be the pilot major of a fleet of 5 ships organized by the India Company of Peter van der Hagen and Johan van der Viken. The general of the fleet was Jacques Mahou, and I was made pilot of his ship, which was the flagship." I mean, I think he sums up kind of his own background right there.
Yeah, that was
where,
perfect.
He grew up in England. He was apprenticed to a ship carpenter. So clearly he learned the science of building ships of the age. He says he served as both a captain and a pilot on Her Majesty's ships. I did a little digging, and he was, I believe, the captain of a supply ship during the fight with the Spanish Armada.
Mm-hmm.
So he would have been captaining one of the ships that was bringing ammunition back and forth to the English warships.
Okay.
And then, he when he says he worked for the Company of Barbary Merchants, that was a merchant company that was responsible for trade in the Mediterranean along the North Africa coast. So he would have had access there. But then he decides, I see that I could go further afield if I were to go work with the Dutch East India Company, and so decides to do so and head out into the
world.
Wide open.
Yeah.
How crazy different is this from our discussion of Yasuke, where we're trying to piece this story together from these sparse sources and these mentions. Right. And then here is William Adams, as you just quoted, telling us, here I am, and this is who I am. So different in terms of just the source base.
Oh, yeah.
It's funny, I was going to mention this later, but I'll go ahead and mention this now. This is the second letter that he wrote. Mm-hmm. The first one he wrote in 1605 to his wife, who was back in England, and he found out later that his letters were not being carried by the Dutch like he thought they were.
Right.
Because the Dutch didn't want the English to find out that he was there, and then for the English to come to Japan to trade as competitors.
Right. That's a whole nother conversation, Doug, because I've done a lot of work on the rivalries between the English and the Dutch in Japan, and it's delightful. It's just delightful.
It's really interesting to get the one letter out that I read the paragraph from. He had to find an Englishman who was working on a Dutch ship who would take it for him in secret. And then when they got to Batavia, I think it was, would seek out the English office there and give it to the English East India Company or whomever the trading company was, so that it could then get to the proper places and they could know that he was alive.
So did all of his letters eventually get to England? Or who had the possession of them for them to be used as sources now for, texts and historical research?
That's a great question. They were eventually delivered to his remaining family in England. I think his wife died in 1650. I'm not quite sure, but his children and extended family there. And then that's where they were kind of compiled. And then
Okay.
I'm actually reading from a translation that I picked up in the town of Hirado, which is where the Dutch and the English trading posts or factories, as they were called, were established. And so I have a copy that's in modern English, not quite exactly what he wrote,
Yeah.
and also in Japanese.
Okay. Awesome. So he came to Japan with the East India Company.
Correct.
And were they aiming for Japan, or was that just where they landed?
So that's an interesting question, because no, they were originally, so they went to South America.
Right.
And were conducting trade and a little bit of light piracy, against Spanish and Portuguese settlements around the coast of Brazil. And then they were, I think, the first Dutch fleet to go through the Strait of Magellan.
Okay.
Francis Drake had done so before for the English, but I think they were the first Dutch fleet to do so. And he details all this in wonderful detail in his letters. They went up the coast of South America on the western side, so up the coast of Chile, but various of the ships got separated from each other. They had decided on a particular rally point, a location where they would meet, but unfortunately, that place was occupied, that island that they were going to meet at was occupied by hostile natives who killed the landing crew, including the captain of Adams's ship and the captain of another ship. And so they were kind of left at a loss of what to do. And he was almost, given command at that point by default.
Right.
So at this point, there were only maybe 2 ships that left that were together, the rest scattered. So he and this other ship decide they're going to try to make it to Japan. And they left the coast of South America at the end of November in 1599 and arrived in Japan, actually the same place that Yasuke did, in Bungo province.
I believe it's April.
Yes.
It blows my mind thinking that they're on a boat that long at sea for, what was that, 8 months? 6 months? My math is not mathing right now.
Yeah, so, well, they had been at sea for a total of 19 months from when they had left, I think. And yeah, they arrived on the 19th of April in 1600.
I only know that because my birthday is the 20th of April, so it's easy. But in watching your crew get smaller and smaller, and you are half a world away, right?
Yeah.
Right. Especially when you're just traveling across the Pacific, not really with any idea. I mean, I'm sure that he was a very good navigator and everything, but you're just kind of hoping that you're getting to where you're trying to go.
Hope you don't run into a storm or two along the way.
Right.
Ugh. That's wild.
So yeah, I believe they arrived with around 20 personnel still alive on the ship when they got to Japan.
Did they ever say how big the crew was when it left? The initial crew?
Each ship, I believe, was 100.
Oh, wow.
So they were down to about 1/5 of the original crew. And then, of course, the other ships, several of them, I think, just sunk. I think one ship made it back to, decided to turn around and make it back to the Netherlands.
Okay.
But the rest all met various fates.
Sure. Not fun. I'll stick to planes. So I have a somewhat loaded question then. So he got to Japan, but how did he end up getting in contact eventually with Tokugawa Ieyasu? And how would you describe that relationship that they had? And again, this is kind of a loaded question because there's a lot of steps and things had happened, right? But how did he go from just, landing in Kyushu and then getting in contact with the Shogun?
That's an excellent question. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, Kyushu was a kind of a hotbed of Portuguese and Jesuit missionary activity. So the area that he landed was under the control at the time of Otomo Yoshimune, who was the son of the person who I mentioned before, Otomo Sorin. And Yoshimune decides, well, okay, these guys are clearly not Portuguese, so we don't know what they are. So I need to let the big boss know. And as your listeners may be aware, if they followed the history, Toyotomi Hideyoshi has at this point died. And he has a very young son who is his heir, but is not of age to be ruling. So there is a council of regents And actually, different from the novel Shogun depiction, there's two councils. There's a council of regents, and then there's a board of commissioners. And Tokugawa Ieyasu was the president of the council of regents. So he was in Osaka at the time, managing affairs, and a message is sent to him to let him know of this appearance of a rather strange ship with this bedraggled crew.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want me to do with them? And he says, okay, send them to Osaka. So the crew and Adams are sent to Osaka, and Adams and the chief merchant of the ship, a man by the name of Jan Houston van Lodenstein, are brought to Tokugawa Ieyasu, and he questions them and talks to them and, gets their story. And then they are variously, kept in confinement. But eventually, Ieyasu decides that he's going to have them and their ship sent from Kyushu to his home base of Edo in eastern Japan. So that's kind of the start. And we see kind of like, if you're familiar with the miniseries or the novel Shogun, that's somewhat similar.
Yeah.
Though, the politics are changed quite a bit as to what's going on. We don't need to dive into that deeply, but it's not necessarily this spectacular friendship from the beginning that we see with John Blackthorne and Lord Toranaga in the show. But Ieyasu was very interested in what Adams and his crew could tell them about the outside world, what they could teach you about naval matters. And one of the important things is, with the fictional series, Ieyasu is gearing up for a military campaign against a man by the name of Ishida Mitsunari, who is leading a coalition of daimyo against him. And they will meet in October of 1600 at the well-known Battle of Sekigahara. One thing that the 2024 version of the show gets right that earlier versions get wrong is that Adams did not teach Ieyasu's soldiers how to use handheld firearms, the muskets that you see them using, because those had been in use in Japan for quite a long time.
Right.
But they did use the cannon from his ship, the Derlifta,
Mm-hmm.
at the Battle of Sekigahara. And it appears that Adams did provide training on how to use the ship's cannons.
Right.
So they were confiscated and used for Tokugawa Ieyasu's military purposes, but he did train crews on how to use them on the battlefield.
Was that kind of how that training and providing that insight, and obviously his knowledge of like building ships, is that how he kind of managed to stick around Tokugawa beyond this time period?
Yes, that's initially he was given a reward in gold, but was not allowed to leave. Ieyasu wanted to keep him there, kind of keep learning from him.
Sure.
Of course, Ieyasu is a busy man. He's just defeated an enemy army and is in the process of setting up what will become the Tokugawa shogunate. So he has to keep this guy around and take advantage of the times that he has to be able to talk to him when he's not running the country stuff, right?
Right.
In 1601, Ieyasu gave the remaining crew members a rice stipend, this was pretty typical of how it worked because rice was the primary currency. So each of the members of the crew who were still alive at this point, for their service in training naval and military matters at whatever level they were doing so. I mean, I'm sure, some of the sailors were just teaching sailor stuff, or maybe they were helping, with the cannon training or whatever. But they were given basically salaries for doing that. And then in 1603, Adams was granted a house with servants and an increased stipend. And then in 1604, that's when we get to Adams being made, quote unquote, a samurai and given the status of hatamoto.
Okay.
Which, for any of your listeners who don't know, a hatamoto, it literally means under the banner. So if you imagine on a battlefield, you have the army with all the banners and so forth. At the banner or the standard of the main leader, the daimyo, his surrounding bodyguards / important officers would be called the hatamoto.
Okay.
Right. So it is an elevated position. It gave him, increased income. He got a new fief, which was located in what's now present day Yokosuka. which is kind of ironic because that's a huge naval base for both the Japanese and the Americans there.
Right.
He, was granted servants, and I think the total value of his little village that he had was 250 koku. Koku is an amount of rice enough to support, one person or so forth for 1 year, right?
Okay.
Not a bad little gig.
No.
It's around the same time, and it may be part of why he was given this elevated status, is that he constructed 2 ships for Tokugawa Ieyasu. The first one was 80 tons, so a smaller kind of coastal going ship.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second was 120 tons. And for reference, the ship that he came to Japan on, the Delifta, was 300 tons. So these are smaller ships, but he's putting his, ship carpentry, ship design knowledge that he learned in that 12 years apprenticing to use building ships for Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Okay. So the Hatamoto lifestyle, obviously, like you described it already, he had a pretty sick gig. It's pretty sweet, right?
Yeah.
But as Sam had mentioned earlier, William Adams was a Protestant, and there were a lot of Jesuits still in the country at this time.
Yes.
Yes.
And the Catholic missionaries there. How did his presence, and both of you probably can feed off each other for this one. This is going to be a fun answer. How did his presence complicate what the Catholic missionaries were trying to do in Japan?
That's actually one of my favorite stories about William Adams. When he basically washes up on the coast, these Jesuits are already there. These Catholics are already there. And my favorite is that the Catholic missionaries that are present are trying to say, don't listen to these guys. Don't listen to these Protestants. They're pirates. You should totally kill them. And I think that's represented in Shogun as well, but it's one of my favorite stories. And so from the beginning of his presence, there is already this rivalry that was elsewhere established in, this Eastern Asian arena, this merchant arena that is now being translated over to Japan. So from the beginning, there are these tensions, which is, for me as a historian, what I love looking at.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think actually the show and the book do a relatively good job of capturing that inherent rivalry because, and we can frame it as a religious rivalry, which it absolutely was. But it was also an economic rivalry, a mercantile rivalry. This was kind of the protected Portuguese and to a lesser extent Spanish backwater in Asia that was secret, and none of those heretic Dutchmen and Englishmen were able to get in, and now one's here. So there's an antagonism that comes from both the nationalism and the religious sentiments, but it's also, if he's here, then that means more will come, and we have to cut that off as soon as we can. And I think it actually says in one of Adams's letters that when they arrived in Japan, as you just described, Sam, the Portuguese were saying these things about, don't listen to them, they're pirates, you should execute them and whatever. And thankfully, I guess, for Adams and crew, Tokugawa Ieyasu kind of took the attitude of, well, they haven't done any piracy here. I have no reason to have them killed.
Very pragmatic.
Yeah. It's like, whatever happens between you guys outside of Japanese waters is not my business kind of attitude towards it. He did have some interesting dealings with all of the European groups that were there. He initially worked for the Dutch, and so he negotiated trade arrangements for the Dutch in 1609, where they were able to set up a trading location. Again, I think I mentioned this before, but they call them factories. They're not like producing goods; it's just the trading post.
Yeah.
At the island of Hirado in Kyushu, was a bit further away. It wasn't right next to Nagasaki where the Portuguese were at. And he negotiated a better deal for the Dutch than the Portuguese got because the Portuguese were confined to Nagasaki and had to trade at fixed prices. Whereas the Dutch,
right,
even though they had their trading factory at Hirado, were able to, at this point, freely travel and negotiate prices. And he brags about this in his letters as he's writing back to England saying, he's trying to court the English East India Company to come to Japan. And part of his sales pitch is, this is what I did for the Dutch, and it's so much better than the Portuguese have it.
He brags about a lot of stuff in his letters. Which is also another, like, congratulations, you have these sources from William Adams, and then you have the historical problem of trying to see how much is accurate and how much is William Adams just very much
Talking himself up.
being very proud. Exactly.
That's the interesting thing when you're able to like layer it with letters from, the Dutch and the English who would
Right.
later come, like Richard Cox, who was the main
Oh my
English
God,
merchant,
yes.
and John Sarris.
We have his diaries, so we have
Yes.
his records.
Both of whom at various times had very high profile arguments and feuds with William Adams.
And there's this accusation that he's kind of inflating his influence within the shogunate.
Yes. And they kind of are suspicious of him because they think he's gone native.
Right.
Because he would wear Japanese clothing and so forth. Yeah.
He's this kind of in-between figure that the English think that he's too Japanese or he's too Dutch, and the Dutch think the exact same, just in reverse, that William Adams is kind of floating in this Venn diagram of cross-cultural encounters. He's this figure that's floating in these in-between spaces.
Absolutely. And to kind of go back to the relationship with the Portuguese and the Spanish, they were obviously not pleased at how he appears to have kind of wormed his way into, or at least the way he tells it, wormed his way into the confidences of Tokugawa Ieyasu. And he did have significant influence. The Portuguese and the Spanish in their sources are accusing him of poisoning the Tokugawa against them, and they blame him for them eventually being kicked out, which, he probably had some words to say about it, but the Portuguese and the Spanish did quite enough to get kicked out on their own.
Right.
But at the same time that that's happening, there's an incident where in 1610, the Spanish governor of the Philippines is blown off course. He's trying to travel from the Philippines to Mexico.
I've heard this story. This is great.
And gets blown off course and lands in Japan at a location which is in present-day Chiba Prefecture. And his ship is wrecked and so forth. So he's kind of stuck there. The 120-ton ship that Adams had built is given to the Spanish governor by Ieyasu, and the Spanish governor is then able to continue his journey on this boat and makes it all the way to Mexico safely. So Adams at least must have, done something right in terms of shipbuilding.
Yeah.
But then another ship is sent back to Japan as kind of like a repayment for the use of that ship, and they're it's filled with all these sorts of gifts. So he does, and Adams has a hand in that moment. It's not just that the ship that he built is used, but he was kind of ferrying around the Spanish governor and getting him to the meetings with Ieyasu and translating and so forth. So as much as there was tension there, he could also be a positive influence even for the Portuguese and the Spanish so-called enemies of his. Maybe he was just trying to get the governor out of the country. I don't know.
He may have had some self-serving intent when trying to get him out of there.
Right.
We don't need any more of the Spanish influence over here. I'm good.
We've got plenty of you Iberians.
So we mentioned actually quite a few times his letters. And then we just also mentioned the sources that we have on the Jesuit side, the Portuguese side, documenting him as kind of like a guy's coming in, he's whispering, poisoning the well, like kind of bad-mouthing us, and we're falling out of favor with the Shogun.
Right.
Is there any good documentation on the Japanese side that documents William Adams's presence and his influence maybe within the court for the Shogun?
I'm going to do two things here. One, in a second, I'm going to defer to Samantha and see if you know, because I'm unfamiliar on this personally. Just it's not necessarily my specific place where my head's stuck in the archives right now.
Sure.
But I will put in a plug. There's a book coming out. It's actually out in digital form, and it's coming out in hard copy in a week and a half. That is called In the Service of the Shogun, The Real Story of William Adams. And it's by a Dutch historian based in Kyoto named Frederick Krins.
Okay.
And he goes through all the Dutch, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Japanese sources. So rather than me try to kind of be well, I think there's this or that, I'm going to say wait a week or two and then go check out this book. The reason I bring this up is because if for any of your viewers or listeners, who were fans of the 2024 series, Krenz was the in-house historian for FX as they were developing and shooting the series. So between him and his wife was also a consultant on it, many of the positive changes from the book and the earlier series that we see in the 2024 series come from his suggestions.
Okay.
And I've actually seen him kind of talk about this and kind of talk about the process and so forth. And, they couldn't change everything that a historian might want them to. But I'm really excited for this book because I have, based off of what I've seen from him in the past and his work with the television series, I think it's going to be a really good book put out that gives us a better picture than what we have now of Will Adams, at least, what we have in current English scholarship.
Sure.
I will add that. So we do have more sources for William Adams, and a lot of those are not just from, the Office of the Shogun, but also from the Dutch merchants and the English merchants, that we have these varied perspectives. And it's through the combination of those from Adams himself, from the Dutch, from the English, and from the Japanese that we're able to construct this clear narrative of who he is and what his role was. And a lot of what's cool is that you can see his influence. Like when you look at the documents that bestow those trade privileges, you can see William's influence. And so it's really in this fun task of what we do as scholars is to bring all of these sources together to then see what his role actually was. And then the other thing I will say is that I'm a cultural historian, so I often look at sources that are not just texts. We do have artistic representations of Adams, which is another way, and a Japanese source that clues us into his role as well. Or at least, let me rephrase that, interpretations of his role.
Right.
So hearing all of this, when we're recording this, it's like literally in the midst of House of the Dragon Season 2 coming out. And this has just gotten me in the mindset, like, all right, who's the mushroom take versus the Septon Eustace take? Thinking of like Fire and Blood in my brain, which I haven't actually read. I only know about it from hearing about it. And it's like, I'm trying to avoid the spoilers. But It's funny, like you said, like there's so many, like he's talking himself up in his own letters. Like, oh, look at me.
Right.
I'm the top dog here. Like,
but that's the cool thing about House of Dragons, that it's this historian kind of task. That's a really good comparison, Doug. I hadn't thought about that.
I have lots of thoughts on that are better saved for a different podcast. But one day I want to build a historical methods course that incorporates House of the Dragon and the Fire and Blood.
Oh, how cool.
Work.
Oh, that'd be so cool. Sign me up.
Anyway.
Yeah, well, pop culture. Now that we're talking about pop culture, kind of, we obviously been referencing James Clavell's book and the 2 miniseries that came out. One back in the 80s? When did it come out? Was it end of the 70s?
75 was the first publication, I believe, yeah.
So 75 in the 70s, and then the new miniseries that just came out earlier this year. It put William Adams indirectly in the spotlight through the lens of John Blackthorne.
Right.
We've already kind of talked about some of the comparisons, but how did you feel about John Blackthorne's portrayal in the new miniseries? And how accurate was it to William Adams from what you've known and learned through all your studies?
We could be here all day for this. So I'll try to be succinct, and I'd also love to hear Samantha's thoughts on it as well. But obviously, Shogun, whether it's, we're talking about the book, whether we're talking about the 2024 version, it's a work of fiction.
Yep.
It's a completely invented narrative. William Adams, the historical person, did not have a romantic love affair with the historical counterpart to Toda Mariko. In fact, it's almost impossible for them to have even met. Things like that obviously are there for the dramatic value.
Right.
We already talked kind of a little bit about the differences with the whole, samurai Hatamoto status comes later than it's shown in the books. But rather than go further with like a laundry list of this was wrong, this was wrong, this was wrong, this was wrong, which literally you could do with any historically set movie.
Right. Liberties are taken.
I do want to point out that the corrections that were made, and like I said, some of it goes to, the credit goes to Frederick Krenz, when I mentioned earlier. Other credit obviously goes to the Japanese production staff, who did a ton of work making it beautiful and also making it feel correct.
Right.
compared to other depictions that you might see and whatever. But I really appreciated the fact that they did not portray this version of John Blackthorne as a jack of all trades savior.
Yeah.
He was not walking in and providing the key to unlock the political conundrums that Toranaga faced. He was there, but he was not the sole lens through which we saw everything happening. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. As somebody who studies 16th century warfare in Japan, I was ready to throw things if they were going to have him teaching Japanese in 1600 how to fire a matchlock arquebus. Right. And then when we get to that portion and they have the Japanese say to him, no, we don't need that. We're good there. We've been doing that for decades. Show us something different. And he's like in this position of, what do I do? I was standing up and cheering because it's like, yes, you have fixed what for me was the single most frustrating misconception that comes with the James Clavell work is that, the Japanese had no idea what guns were until this Englishman shows up and teaches them how to do it. I mean, it wasn't even the case that in 1543, when the Portuguese show up, they had no idea what to do with these boomstick things. I mean, that's a very simplistic and frankly colonial and offensive way to frame it. But that they corrected that was a big positive for me. And it was at that point where, okay, I can kind of overlook some of the silly stuff because they're hitting these main points in a much more accurate manner as far as I'm concerned. But I'd love to hear, Samantha, if you have.
I agree with pretty much everything you just said. And I think that's, I would imagine that's the pretty standard answer, just because, coming from our perspective, I have to be very careful watching anything that's set in this period or set in the Renaissance in general, because I straight up turn into the Leonardo DiCaprio meme from, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where I'm pointing at the television. Yeah, I turn straight into that meme. I guess for self-preservation purposes, I'm very good at distinguishing between, what I know as a historian and still being able to enjoy this as a work of fiction. And I think that that's very clearly intentional from the original novel, that it's this fictional character that's drawing inspiration from William Adams, but he's not William Adams. And I feel like that gives license to do things which I deeply enjoyed from the latest version of, the romance story and stuff, just adding those subplots, which I enjoy as a viewer that I know as a historian. I turned into that meme of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So I do enjoy it. And I think that separation is important and intentional. And you can kind of, in a way, compare that and then the novel of Shogun creating this fictionalized portrayal to things like Silence, where there's a kind of difference in how the historical figures are presented as truth, right?
Absolutely. It will be very interesting, since we have talked about kind of the story of William Adams after what we see represented fictionally in Shogun. I'm very interested to see how they do season 2 and what we get. I have mixed feelings.
Yeah, there's some cast that's not there, and that I don't know how you get the same pull or the same, I'm trying not spoil it for people who maybe haven't watched it. If you haven't already watched it, go watch it now. Like, stop this podcast and go watch it.
We have talked about, his activities afterwards as he's writing these letters, talking about how awesome he is, and he's negotiating trade deals for the Dutch and building a ship and so forth. I wonder if that's going to make for compelling viewing in the same way that, or whether they're going to have to completely invent different aspects of him. One of the things that we haven't mentioned that I do want to mention real quickly is that he was instrumental in what was called the Red Seal system. And these red seals were these basically letters of official trade approval that the Tokugawa government issued in the early days of the Tokugawa government, so the early 1600s. He himself went on voyages to Southeast Asia, primarily what would be now Thailand, to trade and then come back to Japan as part of these. And sometimes he was trading on behalf of the Dutch or the English, and sometimes it was just he himself took a ship out and did it for his own profit, but was doing it under this official trading license that was available. And one of the things that I think would be interesting potentially for your listeners who are familiar with Japan today is we all know, the yaki imo truck, right?
Yep.
Everybody's had a roasted sweet potato in Japan. You have the little truck that roasts them on the charcoals, and it comes through blaring its siren. Well,
Emo.
yes. Allegedly, these come to Japan for the first time, at least, via one of William Adams's trading voyages, where on the way back from Southeast Asia, he stops in present-day Okinawa, so the Ryukyu Kingdom at the time, and they take on a supply of these sweet potatoes, and he takes them back to Hirado, which is there in Kyushu, and then they kind of spread over Kyushu, and eventually they're called the Satsuma Imo. So Satsuma is southern Kyushu, the Shimazu area that I study. But I was reading that, and I was like, that's, if we didn't have William Adams, would we have the Yaki Imo truck?
No, the butterfly effect.
How do you get more important than that?
He didn't brag about that in his letters, I'm sure. Or did he?
Well, not to that extent, but...
So before we move on to our last question, did he stay in Japan for the rest of his life? Or did he make it back? I know the answer to this, but did he make it back to the motherland of England and see his family or not?
No.
Which family?
Yeah. So
touche.
That's something we haven't addressed yet, which maybe we should. But
yeah.
For his initial time in Japan, he, requested several times, but was never allowed to go back by Tokugawa Ieyasu. Just before Ieyasu died, I believe, he did ask for permission to leave and was granted it, but he never took it because the English East India Company hired him to manage their trading posts in Japan at Hirado. So he took that job and moved out to Kyushu to manage that and then just stayed there. And that's where, when he passed away in 1620, that's where he was. The show and whatever shows like a big thing of the Blackthorn character not being allowed to leave. And that was initially true. But even once William Adams himself was given official permission to go back to England if he wanted to, he ended up deciding not to.
Huh.
And then, as Sam alluded to, he had a family back in England with, wife and several kids. And that's who he was writing to in at least some of his letters. But then he also had a Japanese family and 2 children with his Japanese wife. And the children, actually, his son took over his trading privileges and his lands and whatever until the 3rd Tokugawa shogun, Iemitsu, enacted what we know as the Sakoku edicts, so the general closing of Japan to Westerners. Mm-hmm. And any of the half Japanese, half Westerners who had been born from marriages or other relations between Westerners and Japanese were expelled. So I think the last we know of his children, they showed up in Indonesia, in the Dutch colonies of Indonesia, and then they disappear.
Interesting. I didn't know that part. Wow. Okay. When you had mentioned the edict, I was going to say, like, what happened to his Japanese family? His family was here, but wow, I didn't realize that. That sucks. That sucks.
It sucked for his family back in England too, because for a long time they had no word of him. And I'm pretty sure his wife, his English wife, her name was Mary. I think she gets pretty poor off for a while. I think she has to leave the home. Eventually she starts getting some money as like part of his pension and stuff. But for a long time, she's not great off financially.
Yeah.
Blame the Dutch for not sending those letters home.
Right. She's poor for a while, and then eventually the English East India Company starts paying her a portion. I think Adams worked out where they would pay a portion of his East India Company salary to her. And then, interestingly, when he dies, he has in his will that his property should be split between both of his families. So I'm not quite sure how they worked that out. But
yeah, did they know about each other? I'm sure his Japanese family knew that he had a family in England, but
I have no idea.
Surprise.
Yeah. I mean, I think financially that would have helped Mary. Well, Mary was dead because she had passed away first, but his children in England ended up getting, I think, some amount of money that was the proceeds of the sale of some of his property in Japan.
Okay.
But I could be, again, there's a book that I'm really anticipating coming out very soon, which will go, I'm sure, into much detail on this.
There you go. There you go.
Richard Cox's diary entries also mention occasionally Adam's son, if I recall.
Yeah, right.
Oh.
But I mean, those mentions are sporadic.
So before we wrap everything up, I think there was one other question because we mentioned Silence earlier, and I've never actually seen it, but I know kind of about it. You know, there are other foreign-born folks who went to Japan and reached or achieved samurai status during this time period before the country was shut down for outsiders coming in. Do you have any additional names that if people want to do some like follow-up reading or, you know, do a little digging on their own, do you have some recommendations of people to look into? And this question goes to both you guys.
Yes, the book that we're working on.
Yeah, I know. Sam, here you go. Here's your chance. I'm lobbing it up to you.
Hey, I'll take it. So I'm actually co-editing a volume that is forthcoming. We're under review right now on foreigners within the samurai class. And we're bookending it on either side of these kind of closed, and I'm dramatically air quoting here for my audio listeners, these closed border policies in the early 1600s. So we're looking at foreigners who either participate in varied ways within the samurai class in the second half of the 1500s and early 1600s, and then looking at the reopening of Japan that happens in the 1800s. And so looking at foreigners of how they participate as outsiders and this kind of nebulous group within the samurai, and then also how they interpret that identity and that role, which is for me these fascinating questions. And Yasuke and William Adams get so much attention for scholars as well as in pop culture, but there are others that fit into this story that give us a kind of more well-rounded approach. So I'm an Italianist. I come at this looking a lot at the Jesuits. And so what led me to this was actually Giuseppe Chiara, who, essential to that story in Silence. And looking at how his identity as an apostate kind of crosses these border regions of identity. Of he's an Italian Jesuit who abandons the faith and then gets appointed, which you might consider as this honorary samurai, right? He's never giving this military service, but rather instead, I would argue, this ideological defense for Japan against what is seen as a Catholic intrusion, right? That's his role in service to the state. David Nelson, he is a scholar who has worked tremendously. He's over at California Lutheran University. David Nelson, I was on a panel with him at the 16th Century Conference last October, and he's done tremendous work looking at Korean-born samurai. Koreans who are captured as prisoners of war during the invasions of Korea in the 1590s, who are brought over to Japan and then who are embedded into this samurai identity and serve, again, varied roles. There's another really cool instance where the Dutch chief factor arguably serves as this kind of honorary daimyo status, where he's expected to do the kind of residence in Edo.
Sankin Kotai.
Right, exactly. So this is a really fascinating topic. And these two individuals that get so much screen time are only one part of this broader story about foreigners interacting in varied ways and complicating that samurai culture that is so critical to understanding Japan in this moment, in the Edo period, especially.
Yeah, the only thing I could possibly add to that, and I'm super excited to hear about this work, and I can't wait to see the book when it gets out, but one, I was very interested because I had heard of these Korean-born, quote-unquote, samurai before who come over. And obviously, there's a whole story there since that was part of the invasions of Korea under Hideyoshi. And from what I know of some of the individuals, they're the children of rather high-ranking Korean military figures.
Yes.
So I'm really interested. Like, I don't know what the backstory of that is, but it looks fascinating.
Check out David Nelson. He has researched this extensively, and he's contributing the chapter on Korean-born samurai for the volume. But he's done tremendous work on this, and his conference presentation in October was phenomenal.
That
looking
sounds
at
amazing.
Not just this kind of first generation, but also then the legacy of how that role is then carried on for the next several generations. And these
Interesting.
Korean-born samurai were, at this point, of Korean descent. They are involved in, I mean, some high-profile events of the
Right.
1600s and the early 1700s. And so their names pop up, and you're able to kind of see how that legacy is inherited and then valued as time goes on.
So when's your book coming out, Sam?
That's a good question, Doug. We're actually in the internal review process right now, looking at the chapters that we just received. We're under review with publishers. So the safe answer is as soon as possible.
There you go.
There's two more that I'd like to throw in. One, just kind of similar to the Koreans. There was a Chinese Ming loyalist that leaves China during the time that they're being invaded by the Manchus, who would then set up the Qing dynasty. And his escape route is to go join the service of the Shimazu in southern Kyushu. And he becomes an official with them and is granted samurai status sometime in the 1630s, I believe. But then the other one that I want to make sure that we mention is, and I mentioned his name before, he was the chief merchant of the Delifta, the ship that Adams arrived on, a man by the name of Jan Justin van Lodenstein. I hope I'm saying that somewhere near correctly. But he was, much like Adams, treated similarly by Tokugawa Ieyasu. He was seen in their initial meeting. It was him and Adams that went to go visit with Ieyasu and so forth. And then Van Lodenstein served as a gunnery instructor, as a teacher of math and science, and was the first Dutchman to be named a samurai, and was much like Adams, given the same Hatamoto status eventually, serving as a diplomatic advisor and interpreter. So he's almost a Dutch counterpart to Adams.
Yes. Gary Liup, he's done a lot of work on kind of cross-cultural connections in this period for Japan and Europe. He's doing the chapter on Jan Justin for the volume.
Oh, fantastic.
And what's interesting is that you could look at this as this foil in a way to Adams, which is really interesting that Adams gets so much of a reputation. And again, part of this is Adams' own sense of self, but his title actually deals with the foul mouth of Jan Justin, which is just a very
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So yeah, on that, I think what's interesting about the idea that the one that becomes more well known is Adams, and very little is making it into the pop sphere about Jan Justin van Lodenstein, is so much of that has to do not just with, it absolutely is Adams writing these letters and talking about how wonderful he is, but it's then also, you have the whole historiography of British authors going later on, finding out about Adams, and then writing these books about the great Englishman who was the first foreign samurai. And I mean, they're acting almost as his press agents. Right? So that then becomes the story in the Anglophone scholarship of the early times. And then I talk about it in my modern history class with my students, how when we get to the Anglo-Japanese alliance of the early 1900s, one of the symbols that is used is William Adams. There are statues put up in both countries to commemorate this first English quote-unquote ambassador to Japan, as a way of celebrating the military alliance that they have come to in 1902. So it's that, and then it just kind of builds and builds and builds and builds, so that by 1975, James Clavell's writing a novel about the English guy and not the Dutch guy.
Right.
I think that's what brings this all together too, is that it's how these individuals are then remembered. I think that is the common thread across this entire episode, is how these individuals are remembered, how they are recognized and valued in their current moment, and then how they are remembered by immediate generations, and then so far removed for us in 2024.
Right.
On that note, both of them have places in Tokyo named after them.
Right.
I didn't know until just recently that Yaesu, near Tokyo Station, is named for Jan Justin van Lodenstein, whose Japanese name was Yaeyosu.
Yeah.
And so then that kind of morphed into whatever. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know why you talked to me with this book coming out. This is fascinating, and I'm going to learn so much about this from that work. So
We're
I'm glad I
excited.
had both of you here. It really was just phenomenal for you to both bounce. I'm just here. I'm like asking questions and learning. You guys, I love hearing like the back and forth and like really, it's cool.
It's nice when we have willing audiences, because usually my students are just trapped in the classroom and they have to listen to me talk about this. This is nice.
Same. Yeah.
All right. So before we wrap up, Nate, I want to give you a chance to let folks know where they can find you on social media. I know I follow you on Blue Sky and you post some pretty awesome threads on there. You're a fun follow, but feel free to share.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really, it's mostly, I do most of my social media activity on Blue Sky. So if people are interested taking a look at the random stuff I post, whether it's Japanese history or, what day of the week I'm having my traditional banh mi, you can find me at NH Ledbetter. So at NHLEDBETTER.bsky.social. I don't really have any projects other than, the occasional podcast that I show up on like this. I'm very grateful to get the chance to talk to you guys and learn about Samantha's wonderful volume coming out. But instead of making a pitch for myself, I do want to make a pitch for studying Asian history at the college and high school level.
Yes.
Ask administrators of your schools, whether you're a parent, whether you're a student, why are they not teaching our kids about societies that make up over half the world? Especially because it's interconnected as far as we can go back. Globalization is a catchy term, but it's not new. The college students that are out there take classes where they have them and demand them where they don't. Enjoy your anime or your movies or your dramas or whatever, but make the effort to learn the history behind them because that makes it so much richer. And I'm not just saying this because I want to up the enrollments in my particular classes, though that's always a nice thing.
I wholeheartedly agree. Once you have that background in the history and the culture and understand that, it makes, like you said, makes watching, your favorite show or your favorite cartoon or your favorite whatever, it gives it more depth and more, you understand it better, you get the context that's behind the story that maybe is lost on other, if you aren't familiar with it, you may just see it as something else. Yeah, great pitch. I like it. All right. Well, Samantha, thank you so much for joining me today as my co-host. You were phenomenal.
So good being back. And Nate, it was great just hanging out with you for this.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise. It's been fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Nate. And we will hopefully maybe have you back on for a regular samurai episode at some point in the future. We'll figure that out.
You know where to find me.
All right. Thanks. And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Krewe of Japan podcast. Once again, let me thank Dr. Samantha Perez for joining me and stepping in as a guest host on our show today. Thanks, Sam. And of course, a big thank you to Nathan Ledbetter for helping us navigate the life and legacy of William Adams. A legacy, as we found out in this episode, not only helped bridge an alliance between Britain and Japan in the early 1900s, but provided the groundwork for some top-tier entertainment in the form of 2024's Shogun. If you haven't already, go watch that show. Although if you're listening to this, you probably already have. Or maybe check out the book that Nate mentioned that released earlier this summer, recapping William Adams' life. It's called In the Service of the Shogun, The Real Story of William Adams by Frederick Krinz. Are you catching this episode but haven't given our Yasuke episode a listen? Don't worry, I'll have that linked out in the show notes, along with links to our other history-related episodes, like an episode on the topic of lady samurai during the Sengoku period, the imperial family from the start to present day, New Orleans' earliest connection to Japan, Jokichi Takemine, Lafcadio Hearn, also known as Koizumi Yakumo, and so much more. Check them out, they'll be all linked out in the show notes. Which aspect of William Adams' life fascinated you or even surprised you the most? Share with us on Instagram, Facebook, X, Twitter, TikTok, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, YouTube at Krewe of Japan Podcast. That's KREWEOFJAPAN PODCAST. While you're there, give us a comment, follow, like, retweet, share, whatever floats your boat. Let us know how you're enjoying the podcast. Or maybe you like to give your feedback in a more private setting. Send us an email at kreweofjapanpodcast@gmail.com. We'd really love to hear from y'all. Speaking of feedback, if you're enjoying this episode or any of the episodes from this season or previous seasons, please feel free to take a second, only a second, and leave us a 5-star rating and or review on your favorite podcast streaming app. Every single one of those 5-star ratings and or reviews helps others interested in Japan and this kind of content find the podcast. Or maybe you're listening on YouTube. Click that like and subscribe button, or just let a friend know about us. That works too. I'm 100% sincere when I say that any and all support is incredibly appreciated. But that's it for today. Until next time. Looking to start your own podcast and don't know what platform to use? Tell me about it. When we started the Krewe of Japan podcast, we tried a bunch of the big name recording platforms, but always came back to the one we're still currently using to this day, Zencastr. Zencastr is now the all-in-one solution making podcasting easy. In addition to its high audio and video quality for podcast production, Zencastr provides a full suite of production tools to record, produce, and publish studio quality content from the comfort of your home. Just log in through your browser and start recording. It's that simple. For us, we simply send out links to our guests and they join the lobby. But before you know it, it's all done and you have your studio quality audio and up to 4K video right there ready for you, right when you finish. The best part is having their multi-layered backups to ensure that your recordings are in the highest quality, regardless of anyone's internet connection stability. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcasts in one place and distribute to all the major destinations. It's really that easy. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use our code Krewe of Japan, KREWEOFJAPAN, and you'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencastr paid plan.